Hi, I'm Mike. We're here for Five Shops named Moe's. It's all about geography. It's from the late Robert Schoenfeld. In the history of the American comic book, St. Louis, Missouri is second only to New York City. So it's a great place to examine the phenomenon of comic book fandom and the comic shop. The development of national comic book fandom followed the model of the older science fiction fandom. The objects of both fandoms were the mass-produced science and fantasy pulps and comic books. The trajectory of both fandoms is strikingly similar. Fans corresponded with the editors of the pulps and later comics through letter columns where addresses were routinely printed. Fans began to correspond with one another through letters handled by the U.S. Post Office. A rich tradition of newsletters and amateur fan magazines proliferated. Fans acted upon an impulse to connect in person. Pro shops for golfers and bowlers, bait and tackle shops for fishing enthusiasts, antique toy stores for toy collectors, local cyclery for bike riders. These communities of practice share what sociologist Ray Oldenburg called a third place, neither home nor work, but a space offering respite from the demands of mere survival. James G. adapts his term affinity group to affinity space in reference to virtual computer simulations. His notion still resonates within the physical realm. An affinity space is a place or set of places where people can affiliate with others based primarily on shared activities, interests, and goals, not shared race, class, culture, ethnicity, or gender. They have an affinity for a common interest or endeavor. Early fan gatherings on the East Coast culminated in the first World Science Fiction Convention held in New York City in 1939. When St. Louis hosted the 1969 World Convention, it was Robert Schoenfeld who edited the program and organized a comic book component, including a dealer room and an exhibition of comic book production art. Similarly, the first comic book conventions were held in New York City in the mid-1960s. By the 1970s, in most major U.S. cities, comic book conventions had become commonplace. Unlike sci-fi fandom, comic book fans found an additional way to connect, the comic book specialty shop. Up until the advent of these shops, comics, like the earlier pulps, had been part of the national newsstand distribution system. It was Phil Sulin. He was a New York City high school teacher and comic fan. He established a national network of direct market comic book retailers and signed deals with the major publishers. He set up a warehouse outside the printing plant of World Color Press in Sparta, Illinois, only an hour's drive from St. Louis. This is from the back cover of the one-shot commemorative comic book produced for the event by Joe Kubert's School of Cartoon Art. And this is the abandoned Sparta plant with my youngest child Will, from May 2010. Among Suling's first retailers were Bob and Rich Pugel of St. Louis. These young St. Louis brothers were picking up the books at Suling's warehouse across the river and operating out of their parents' house in South St. Louis in the mid-1970s. The story of Five Shops takes place within a 3.5-mile radius of the Bevo neighborhood in South St. Louis City, where the Pugels opened their shop in 1976. The Bevo Mill, midway between the Bush residence at the brewery by the river and their summer home further west, named for the non-alcoholic beverage Bush produced during Prohibition. It's from the 1979 Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide. The city's second comic book shop was also located in the Bevo neighborhood, just east of B&R Comics Center. 0.3 miles, roughly a 6-minute walk. I interviewed Rich Pujol in 2004. He recalled a rivalry. There was absolutely no competition from 1976 until 1983. I guess somebody eventually figured, if this bozo can do it, why not me? Bruce Mohart had left a job he had had for a long time. He was divorced or something, needed to find a place to live, so eventually he got the building, or he lived upstairs and the store downstairs. Fortunately, it was only a couple blocks from my store. It seemed kind of strange. The second store in the entire area had to be several blocks away. Bruce was born in St. Louis in May 1934, the same month as the release of Famous Funnies #1 to newsstands. During World War II, Bruce held a part-time job working at Ulysses Grant McKinney's used junk shop in South St. Louis. The old man was willing to pay Bruce $1 a week. Bruce negotiated a deal where he was paid every Friday in 100 used comic books. By the time he graduated from St. Louis University, Bruce had accumulated 10,000 Golden Age comic books. He was married in 1956. He was drafted the following year and served in the Korean War. Following his honorable discharge in 1959, Bruce went to work for International Shoe Company, headquartered in downtown St. Louis on Washington Avenue. Bruce answered a want ad in the Post-Dispatch. A man was looking for Golden Age Batman comics and other Golden Age books. In 1966, Bruce sold his comic book collection to a man from Poinet, Wisconsin. With the money, Bruce installed a new bathroom and added a new room in the basement of his family home. Today, with that collection, he might have built a couple $1-million homes. Over the next decade, as he traveled the Midwest and East Coast as a sales representative for International Shoe Company, Bruce had occasion to visit other used bookstores. He started to reassemble his collection. In 1976, Bruce partnered with a local comic book show. Today, the St. Louis Spectre Club Comic Show is in its 45th year. On July 25th, later this month, the Spectre will hold its first show since November of 2019. Now, by 1978, Phil Suling had lost a lawsuit, effectively ending his monopolistic hold over his direct market system. The way was clear for publishers to cut direct market deals with new players. Russell Ernst, a vice president of Mercantile Bank in St. Louis, started Glenwood distributors across the river, initially out of his home in Glen Carbon, Illinois. Russell Ernst partnered with Nick Kosarak, who opened a comic book retail shop, Fantasy Books, in Collinsville, Illinois, in 1980. Nick got his books through Ernst's Glenwood distributors. Often when he worked out of his office, Bruce Mohart walked down Washington Avenue to A. Amerton Books on his lunch break. Sometimes he would run into Russell Ernst and chat about sports and comics. One day, Ernst asked Bruce if he would like to open a direct market comic book shop in St. Louis. Bruce spent a few weeks working with his old friend Nick Kosarak at Fantasy Books in Illinois, learning about pre-orders and the pull and hold system. By the close of 1982, Bruce was ready. Bruce's shop was a success from the start. And after nearly 10 years at his shop with over 300 pull and hold customers, Bruce was having difficulty with a landlord who seemed unwilling to make routine repairs to the building. In 1992, Bruce moved his business to a new location, 2 blocks west on Gravois, even closer to B&R. In August '94, Bill Smith, an investigative reporter at the Post-Dispatch, had tried to start a comic book fan club. He complained to Bruce that he was having little luck getting people together. Bruce contacted some of his friends and loyal customers. The charter meeting of the Silver and Golden Age Collectors of St. Louis, Saga, met in the back room of Bruce's shop in 1994, November. The group, now with 70 members, remains active to this day. Through the 1990s, a young insurance salesman from St. Louis began showing up at the local Spectre shows. He befriended Bruce Mohart. Bruce himself drew a comparison between his relationship with the younger man and the relationship he had enjoyed with Ulysses Grant McKinney more than 4 decades earlier. Although Mark had never operated a comic book business, as he made plans to purchase Bruce's Moe's Comics and Stories, Mark already owned one. All American Comics was a comic book shop founded in 1985 just outside the city by Bruce's friend, Johnny King. In '94, Johnny sold his shop to Alan and Terry Lorum. Eventually, the couple moved the shop even further west on Watson, where Mark Faraci met the couple and began selling used comic books through their shop on consignment. Although the Lorums held a direct market distributorship, many customers only dropped by their place to see what new back issues Mark had added to his table. By 1998, the Lorums had sold their business to Mark. Mark registered the names All American Collectibles and Moe's Comics with the Missouri Secretary of State, merged the two businesses, and opened his shop at 6510 Chippewa in 1999. In addition to weekend Pokemon tournaments, on the first Monday of every even-numbered month, Mark hosted a local comic book fan club, which he eventually joined. Saga met in the back room of his shop after closing time for nearly 5 years. Despite Mark's best efforts to work with his landlord, a leaking roof, anathema to comic books, forced Mark's hand. He relocated his shop further south in 2010. In August of 2016, Mark Faraci passed away after a year-long battle with cancer. His widow, Jill, kept the shop afloat for a year, but she had no interest in comic books. She sold the business to David Schmidt. He took over the business in 2017. For decades, David has owned and operated a successful comic book shop in Waterloo, Illinois. He was a lifelong comic book collector. David was well known to comic book fans as a dealer who set up at the regional shows, including the local Spectre Club comic book show. Seems ironic that as a teenager, David had worked for Nick Kosarak in Collinsville in the early 1980s. David purchased All American Collectibles, Moe's Comics, and breathed new life into the business. David wanted to expand his operation. He wanted more space, and the shop on Hampton just wouldn't do. He spent over a year looking for a new location. David planned the move for a 3-day weekend with a seamless reopening at the new location. David's plans were complicated by the COVID pandemic, when a number of his employees were quarantined. The new shop opened on March 9th, 2021. Shop number 3, not long ago, the empty lot, 6510 Chippewa. Mindful of his shop's history, the generations of comic book fans who have pursued their love of comic books through Moe's and All American, David rolls up his sleeves once again and looks forward to a bright future in the community of shop number 5.